Hey there once again, everybody. Today, we're going to be finishing up chapter 27, continuing this look at American imperialism. Although this is not the last look at American imperialism. We will touch on it again as we look at our progressive era presidents like Taft and Wilson, and we will see how American interests abroad continue to be a part of their agenda and a part of their policy. But we want to look at today are sort of the immediate years following the Spanish-American War and how the United States' role begins to change in the world and how the United States starts to use more influence and use more of that presence in the world and is far more involved in certain major events in the late 19th century and early 20th century, demonstrating that power and, like I said, and really can't stress enough, just becoming much more of a major player in world politics, becoming one of those big powers to just play a role in a lot of other countries, not necessarily colonizing. Some of these examples may not have to do with actually colonizing, but exerting influence, exerting power, maintaining interests and doing things, passing policies or implementing things or taking actions that are meant to protect American interests in the world and protect American interests in other parts of the world. So with the end of the Spanish-American War, of course, in 1898, the United States is now a major player in world politics, and the United States now has several overseas territories, including some territories in the Pacific. And so that opened up just a lot of different opportunities for the United States as far as trade and markets and those sorts of things. And so it became, particularly for those pro-imperialist people that felt imperialism for the United States was important, at least in an economic sense, that the United States needed to take advantage of the economic opportunities brought with that, that having that presence in the Philippines, that meant that just opened up a door, that just opened things up for the United States to get further involved in Asian markets and all of the different, possibly quite lucrative economic opportunities that were there. And a big sort of gem in all of that was China, and to be involved in trade with China and all of the vast wealth that could be obtained from trade with China. Now, China, if you remember your world history, and I don't know if you even went over this in world history, China by the late 19th century had been for centuries, they had been quite isolated and quite cut off from the rest of the world. They had not wanted to trade or wanted to have any outside influence or anything like that. So they had really quite closed themselves off and had not modernized and different things. And by the time we get to the late 19th century, that had left China quite vulnerable because they had not modernized their economy. They had not modernized their military. Their political system was quite corrupt. There had been numerous wars and conflicts within China, again, leaving them very vulnerable and therefore open to what I'm certain they were trying to avoid in doing all of that, and that was outside influence. So China is still independent, don't get me wrong, but it is being very much controlled to a pretty high degree by a lot of European powers. And many European powers, including Britain and France and Russia and Germany and even Japan, which is not European, of course, but had established various spheres of influence, or what might be referred to as spheres of influence in China. So they're not controlling China from a political sense. They do not colonize it. They wouldn't say it was their territory. But to say that they have a sphere of influence means that they're controlling it economically, where they, have pretty much, exclusive economic control over that particular area. And parts of Chinese cities, or in some cases entire Chinese cities, economically, it's pretty much run by Britain or France or something like that. It means that they have strict economic control over it. And, part of that means if this is Britain's area of Beijing or whatever, or just a European area, then they're going to be very limiting on who can trade there and what. They're trying to control that so they can make all of the money off of that. Now, that really concerned a lot of people in the United States, particularly American investors. It concerned a lot of very pro-imperialism kind of people, because what they didn't want and what they feared these spheres of influence would eventually lead to was China being colonized by Britain, and it being carved up by Britain and France and Russia and Germany and all those other countries, similarly to how but Africa and several other places had done, and that they would colonize it and therefore cut the United States out of the deal. The United States, what they don't want is the United States to be totally left out of China. They want a piece of the pie as well. And so this leads to a policy by the United States, or rather by the Secretary of State at this time, John Hay. He's the same one that said the line about the Spanish-American War being a splendid little war. He sent a series of what were called the open door notes, and it leads to something called the open door policy. It is basically a series of letters that John Hay sent to the leading powers of those European countries like Britain and France and Germany, and also Japan and Russia, sent to them suggesting that these spheres of influence be kept open. Just think of the phrase there, open door. So saying that it would be best for everybody, all parties involved, if you, within your sphere of influence, don't restrict anybody from trading there. So in other words, just saying all spheres of influence, should be open for all countries and all interested parties and all investors to trade there. It doesn't mean that you don't have a sphere of influence where you're not exerting some economic control, but you shouldn't be, it wouldn't be good to just bar the United States or anybody else from trading within your sphere of influence totally, suggesting that it's in the best interest of everyone if no one European country or the United States or Japan or whoever, if no one group has a total monopoly. Again, it's just the suggestion that we keep China open to everybody, that everybody can take advantage of those nice lucrative markets. So that's called the open door note, or sometimes this leads to this open door policy about keeping China open to trade. Now, they don't consult the Chinese about this, and it certainly does not make any considerations for what China wanted and what those people wanted, which is what we'll get to in just a moment. But this was something that was seen by a lot of Americans as a big victory for the United States, because it was a moment where, first of all, the United States kind of, intervened, I guess you could say, certainly not in a hostile way, but the United States kind of made this suggestion to European countries that was not, it's not like European countries just went, oh yeah, we'll do that, but they don't say no, because they don't outwardly disagree with it, and they don't say, who do you think you are, United States, go away. It's kind of assumed then that everybody sort of agreed to it, and so it's seen as a victory for the United States, because you have this suggestion by the United States that European countries seemed to accept, or at least they didn't outright reject it. And that also means good things for the United States economically, at least those that were interested in trade with China and opening up those markets and businesses and investing and all that kind of stuff, because it means that China is going to be open to that. Newspapers loved it, of course, because it was an example of the United States kind of flexing muscle and being listened to and by European powers, and European powers, they could even spin it, some of those yellow journalists might even spin it as kind of a, we showed them sort of a thing, even though that's not exactly what happens. Now, once again, this is all done without any regard to what China wanted or what China thought was best, and they're pretty much being controlled economically by European powers, and now to an extent the United States even, or at least by investment and so forth. And that does lead to a lot, or rather it increases some, anti-intervention kind of sentiment that was already there in China. There were already various nationalist Chinese groups or nationalist groups in China that resented and did not want all of this influence by European powers, as you can probably imagine. They wanted China to just be for China, and they did not like the fact that these European countries were coming in and not exactly colonizing them, but controlling them just the same. And so there were multiple, groups that were trying to work against that, and that eventually leads to a major uprising in China in 1900 called the Boxer Rebellion. It's called the Boxer Rebellion because this particular Chinese nationalist group were typically trained in the martial arts, and so that martial arts looked like boxing to a lot of outsiders, and so they called them the Boxers. But these were again, Chinese nationalists that did not like all this influence, and so they uprise, they rebel, and they were targeting specifically, any kind of foreigner. They were going after foreigners of any sort, whether they were there for economic purposes, if they were government officials, business owners, property owners, and also a lot of missionaries. And so there were a lot of huge amount of violence. This went on for several months, and the United States eventually committed a couple of thousand troops to go put down this rebellion. The United States contributed to a multinational force, American, British, French, German, several others, sending troops to put down this rebellion, which it is eventually put down. And the spheres of influence remain. They even eventually force, when there's kind of agreements worked out at the end of this, force China to pay reparations, to pay a lot of money in damages because of the Boxer Rebellion. So not only does the United States kind of exercise this influence in making sure China was open economically. In other words, let's make sure we protect our opportunities to exploit China for whatever it is they have to offer, and that we can invest in all those kind of things, but also contributing to this conflict, or putting down this conflict when China tried to rebel against all those kinds of things. That eventually leads to John Hay issuing what's called kind of the second round of open door notes, or the second round of open door letters. Same concept as we saw the first time. But that time John Hay, just once again kind of re-emphasizing the importance of keeping China open to trade, and all of it was seen again as by many Americans as a big victory for the United States, and an important moment economically and diplomatically by the United States as well. And all those events in China and so forth certainly continue to establish the United States as a major player in world politics, and this time getting their hand in, or getting the United States' hand in, China and other Asian markets as well. Now, another place we want to look at where we see imperialism, or not outright colonizing. We're not talking about the United States acquiring more territories, but exerting great influence, and what some people might call just downright meddling, and doing some things that are definitely questionable in order to get its way, in order to protect those interests, and all of this taking place under the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt, let's talk about him as a president. We last left Teddy Roosevelt as the Secretary of the Navy under President McKinley, and that he resigned that position to actually go and fight the war. Well, Roosevelt was nominated as McKinley's running mate when he ran for election as president, nominated as the vice president, mainly as a means by, he's from New York, and there were other New York politicians and New York political machine leaders and some of those guys that, quite frankly, wanted Teddy Roosevelt out of the way, saw him as too much of a troublemaker, that he didn't play party politics. He does what he wants to do. He doesn't do what the machine tells him what to do, and all that. Wasn't big on the patronage thing. And so as a means of trying to get him out of the way so that they could still play their patronage politics in New York, he was the governor of New York. That didn't really play that game. Roosevelt was. They get him nominated as the vice president because, as you probably know, if you think about it, the vice president does not have too many official duties. Now, they can be quite busy, and certainly today they have, carved out much more of a role for themselves. But the vice presidency was sometimes, not all the time, but certainly in this case, it was seen as this is a way where we can put him in a position where he's got a position, but he really can't do anything. He doesn't really have too much going on. So that's how that happened. Teddy Roosevelt becomes the vice president. But of course, the vice president does have a pretty darn big role to play should something happen to the president, which is what happens, because McKinley gets assassinated. He's assassinated by an anarchist, becomes the third president to be assassinated. And so Teddy Roosevelt, who had been nominated for the vice president position as a means of keeping him quiet, now ends up as the president. And so we'll look more at his presidency in the next chapter, his domestic stuff as a progressive. But as a foreign policy-wise, we should already know, given his exploits in the Spanish-American War, that Teddy Roosevelt is definitely an expansionist. He believes the United States should protect its interest, and whether or not it's hard, you can't really get into the psyche of these people and see what they really thought. but at least publicly, at least his verbal stance on all this stuff is the United States has to play this big important role so that we can protect others and we can protect some of these particular Latin American countries that are not capable of protecting themselves, that the United States has got to step in and be involved in those countries, not so we can be big and powerful and beat everybody up and be a bully, but so we can be the protector, the knight in shining armor to come save these other countries that need saving so that nobody else will bother them. That's kind of his stance on it. Again, whether or not they really believe that, or that's just sort of a ruse for, we're going to be big and powerful and run everybody's life, that's all debatable. And historians argue a lot about Teddy Roosevelt and exactly what his intentions were and whether or not he was right or wrong and some of the things that he did. Anyway, before we get into not getting into all of that, a way that we can easily, or that Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy or his position on a lot of this, how the United States should conduct itself as far as world affairs, is often summarized in this phrase that he spoke, where he said oftentimes that it was important and that what the United States ought to do is to, quote, speak softly and carry a big stick. And to sometimes get called the big stick policy, which if you think about it, it makes sense. It's sort of a metaphor for, don't use harsh words. We don't go around just picking fights. We don't go around looking for trouble, but if there is trouble, we'll respond. If there is trouble, we'll respond, and we will flex our muscle when we have to, and we're not just going to stand by and let things happen that don't serve our interests. So it is definitely a step, probably about, hundreds of steps away from the isolationist policy we saw the United States emerge with in the very, very beginning. And so there are different examples throughout Roosevelt's presidency of exercising this big stick policy of showing we mean business, getting involved in certain things, protecting American interests no matter what, even doing things that some may say are quite questionable. Some might even use words as strong as illegal, or at least as Teddy Roosevelt as a president is concerned, things that may not have been within his power as president. Teddy Roosevelt, just on a side note, I've mentioned before, there are presidents that kind of are sort of big milestone moments in the development of the presidency itself and the expansion, particularly the expansion of presidential power. Like, for example, we talked about Jackson in that sense, that Jackson was, one of the first ones to really believe it was the president's job to do this, this, and this, and to use the veto because of personal preferences and those kind of things. Roosevelt's one of those too. He really believes that it is his job to be a leader and his job to decide, to be the decider in these kinds of things, and that Congress should support him. That he didn't need Congress's approval for A, B, and C. He was just supposed to do it and lead and do what he thought was right, very much like Jackson in that sense. But in this case, we see him taking that overseas, not just in the United States. But one of the biggest ways that we see this big stick policy in the United States really trying to exert its interests in Central America, this time we're back to Central America, has to do with a Central American canal, what will eventually become, of course, the Panama Canal. Some of you probably already recognize that's where we're going. So there had been interest for a long time about building a canal somewhere through Central America so that you would not have to go all the way around South America to get from one side to the other. And particularly with trade increasing the way that it was, and now after the Spanish-American War, with the United States having colonies in or territories in the Philippines and Guam and in Hawaii, the idea was, the United States needed more mobility for trade purposes, after Mahon's whole, beef up the Navy kind of thing. And a lot of that, is part of what Roosevelt wants to do here as well, increasing American naval presence and increasing the mobility of the United States Navy to respond to things. The interest, or the American interest in building a Central American canal, was very much heightened after the Spanish-American War. It had been talked about before. It had been in planning stages before. Other countries have even attempted it before. France, in particular, had attempted to build a canal, I think through what's now Nicaragua, and had failed to complete it because it's a very, very difficult thing from an engineering standpoint, but there were other factors that were preventing it from being successful. Anyway, it had been talked about a long time. Nobody had ever done it. The United States had kind of made a deal previously with Britain, and that they both possessed, the United States and Britain had joint sort of rights to build a canal through. Again, I'm wanting to say it's Nicaragua. It really doesn't matter. But Teddy Roosevelt re-energizes that interest in building such a canal, but also wants it to be strictly an American thing, that Britain shouldn't have anything to do with it. We don't want to share it with them. We want to do this on our own. And so first we have the negotiation of the Hay-Pauncefoot Treaty. I think that's how that's pronounced. And what this was a treaty between the United States and Britain. You can see John Hay there, in which Britain basically gave up their rights to build a canal through that particular area and basically handed that over to the United States, saying, okay, you get to build a canal through that particular area. So that secures the rights to do so. But then I'm going to go back a second. Getting the rights to do it and then actually doing it are different things, because all that did was it gave rights to build a canal in a particular area. Eventually, they decide, or Teddy Roosevelt starts to have, and the United States government starts to have more interest in building the canal, not through Nicaragua, but through what is now Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, which I wish I had a map on here, but it's the that little bottom strip of Central America right before it hits South America. At the time, that was not an independent nation. That was part of Colombia. And they decide that's the best place to do it. We'll build a canal along there. Well, you got to get permission from Colombia since it's their land. You got to, lease the land from Colombia in order to do it. Well, Colombia wouldn't lease it. They refused to allow any kind of deal. So Roosevelt's not too happy about that. But he also knows, as other people are involved in this, it's not just Roosevelt. You've got, heads of companies and different people that are stand to gain from such a canal being built. They also know that Panama, which is a province of Colombia, that the Panamanian people there are not too happy with Colombian rule. There have been uprisings and talk of uprisings before. And so basically what happens is the United States sort of encourages the Panamanian people to revolt against Colombia. And it's, again, this is where it gets really questionable and fuzzy about exactly what the United States was involved in. Roosevelt, I think the consensus is he didn't start it for sure. He didn't tell them to rebel or anything like that, but it certainly was encouraged. And also, when the Panamanian people start rebelling, Roosevelt makes sure, sneakily, that the U.S. Navy is close by, and oops, it prevents Colombia from getting to Panama to stop them from putting down the rebellion. So while the United States did not cause it, the United States certainly welcomed it and may have even done some things to ensure that it was successful. And then when the Panamanian people, the whole thing is over like in 72 hours or something like that, because Colombia really wasn't able to respond to it. And then when it's over, the United States, of course, led by Teddy Roosevelt, recognizes Panamanian independence like the next day, which is kind of crazy that would happen, recognizes them as an independent nation. And as you can imagine, Panama was more than willing to lease the land for a canal. So the building of the canal is obviously going to be the United States getting involved in a Central American country, but particularly the way in which the United States acquired the land was pretty sneaky. And some historians and some critics would even argue completely, unconscionable and something that's indefensible. But nevertheless, it is what happens. So the United States is able to begin work on the Panama Canal at that point. And the Panama Canal, for all the questionable things that are done and the underhanded way in which it might have been done, it is quite the engineering marvel. It is a miraculous achievement that it is built. It took many, many years, of course. And it wasn't just the engineering challenges that the Panama Canal presented. The big reason why no Central American canal had really been successful up until that point, the very reason why the French had given up, was because of disease. This is in a tropical climate where diseases like malaria and yellow fever run rampant. That was why the French had to give up, is because all their people were dying. So one individual, who actually happens to be an Alabamian, that was very instrumental in that whole process in making this possible was William C. Gorgas, or Dr. William C. Gorgas, again, an Alabamian. He was an Army doctor that figured out how to eradicate a large portion of those diseases like malaria by sanitizing the water, because he realized that diseases like malaria were spread by mosquitoes. And in this tropical climate, and particularly in a canal building zone where you've got lots of just standing water sitting around, and y'all know what happens with water that's just standing there stagnant, that's where mosquitoes breed, and then you get lots and lots of mosquitoes and lots of diseases. But he figured out if we either get rid of the standing water or sanitize the standing water, then you get rid of those diseases and you're able to get the outbreaks under control, and you're able to build the canal. So it's an engineering marvel. You can look up more about the Panama Canal and how it was done. And it was completed in 1914 and is still in use, of course, today. It's been expanded and all kind of things. And the United States maintained possession not of Panama, but of the canal until 1999, actually. So that's really relatively fairly recent that it was handed back over to the Panamanians. So a big way in which the United States has not only flexed their technological capability, but also increased military, visibility and those kind of things with the Panama Canal, largely to be considered one of the greatest accomplishments of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. He's not president by the time it's finished, obviously, but it was begun under him. He would probably have considered that certainly his... Hope you like our Mario bells. Isn't that fun? Consider that probably one of his biggest accomplishments. One last thing, as far as Roosevelt's big stick policy, or a way that Roosevelt would have felt it was important for the United States to exert its influence. There is something that Roosevelt, a policy that Roosevelt initiates that becomes called the Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, or Roosevelt's Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Corollary meaning basically like an add-on. If you remember that Monroe Doctrine back in 1820 that we talked about, that was that statement by then President Monroe suggesting that the United States would not tolerate intervention by European countries or any further colonization by European countries in Latin America. And did not outright say, but did definitely suggest that the United States would protect Latin American countries. This is Roosevelt adding on to that, or clarifying that, and expanding on that and being much more specific about exactly what that means. Again, for Roosevelt, you can see here his point of view, which it'll make more sense when I tell you what the Roosevelt Corollary says. It's all about fulfilling the Monroe Doctrine and upholding that promise. He would take it from a point of view as, we promised our friends and our neighbors that love us and we love them in Latin America that we protect them, and we've got to make sure that we do that. So anyway, in the Roosevelt's Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, it has to do with the finances of Latin American countries. This basically says that the United States will, if Latin American countries are in debt, if they are in debt to European countries in particular, if they've taken out loans that they cannot pay back, then the United States will collect those debts. The United States will be the debt collector. Now, from their perspective, what they didn't want, what they say they're trying to prevent is, let's say that a Latin American country is in debt to Britain or France or somebody. Well, what's to stop Britain or France then from coming in and basically taking over that country until the debt is paid off? That's what the United States didn't want. They didn't want them being taken over or monopolized by Europe, and Europe using the excuse of, well, they owe us money in order to do that, so we're going to come in and take over until they pay us back. So this is basically saying that you don't have to do that, Europe, because we'll do it. We're going to be the debt collector. We will intervene in the finances. We will collect the debts, or in some cases, we'll pay off the debt so that now they're indebted to us, and not you, that whole thing. You can see how from Roosevelt's perspective and from many others, they would have seen this as, this is about protecting those countries. It's about preserving their independence. We want to make sure that they don't get in such financial trouble that their independence is compromised. But you can also see it from the point of view, which this is a point of view a lot of Latin American countries would have had. This is just further getting the United States entwined into Latin American affairs, further giving the United States the ability then to be the debt collector and to then intervene and meddle in affairs and dictate policy and basically have our way, because now we're holding that leverage over these Latin American countries of, we paid your debts for you, or we're, you owe us money, and that whole thing. So a lot of people refer to this and other things as a, quote, bad neighbor policy. The Monroe Doctrine had been referred to oftentimes as a good neighbor policy. We want to be a good neighbor to Latin American countries and protect and help them. But a lot of people would look at these extensions of the Monroe Doctrine as being the bad neighbor thing, because it was used and is still used. This is still ongoing. Used to justify American intervention in Latin American affairs when they weren't wanted and when they may not have been warranted. It has been used by other presidents to just justify downright meddling, policing, just getting involved in things that we otherwise... It's going to take getting used to, that we might otherwise not have had much of a say-so in. So it's, kind of like, I think I've used this phrase before, saying the Caribbean, Latin America, and all this is our bathtub. We get to play in it. And, this justifies a lot of actions, which a lot of people would find quite questionable. So certainly by the early 20th century, the United States is definitely considered by other world powers as one of the big ones, one of the ones that has to be consulted, that needs to be consulted, and upgrading their embassies and ambassadors and all that kind of stuff, and seeing the United States is certainly very diplomatically important. So we'll talk about Roosevelt again when we look at his domestic policy, and we'll still be looking at some of the foreign policy stuff when it comes to his successors. So we'll be looking at what's going on at home at that time, which has to do with progressivism. So that's what we'll be looking at next time.